Good evening all and welcome. I'm going to be honest with you guys, my throat is not feeling all that great. It's been a real struggle to record today's episode, and I've got an appointment with the throat doctor for tomorrow because it really hurts a lot while I'm narrating and I don't want to compromise my vocal cords. So depending on what the doctor says tomorrow, I may need to just pause Nature Week and resume it once my throat is better, and I'm just really sorry for anyone I've let down with this. But I've got to look after my throat, otherwise there'll be no more stories ever again from me. But with that being said, enjoy cabin stories and let the darkness take control. Everything happened back in 2011 on my reservation in Canada. I'm Algonquin First Nation, and where I grew up, people treated the paranormal with respect and acknowledged its existence, and most of us just left it alone. At the time, I was 16 and living in a nearby city with my mum during the school year so that I could attend a better high school. Every weekend, though, we drove back to the reserve to see my dad and little brother. One Friday evening in the fall, we pulled into the driveway just after dark, and the second we walked inside, I could already tell that something was wrong. My dad and cousin were sitting at the kitchen table drinking beers in near silence. Both of them worked as police officers on the res, and usually when they looked that exhausted, it meant they'd spent the week dealing with something ugly. I mentioned that I was heading to a party later that night at a cottage deep in the woods, and the second I said that, they both exchanged an uncomfortable look. "What?" I asked. My cousin leaned back in his chair and said, "You should probably hear what's been going on." Earlier that week, they'd started getting calls from an older woman who lived alone near the edge of the reserve. She kept reporting that someone was outside her house late at night knocking on all her windows, not just one window, all of them. She said it sounded like multiple people circling the house at once. The first time my dad and cousin responded, they assumed it was just bored teenagers messing with her. But when they arrived, no one was there. There were no footprints to be found, and nothing appeared to be disturbed. Then it happened again 2 nights later after some heavy rain. This time the ground around the house was soaked in mud, and one of the windows the woman swore had been knocked on sat behind a massive puddle. So, logically, you'd assume there'd be footprints everywhere, and yet there were none. By Thursday, the entire reservation was now talking about it. More people started reporting the same thing, knocking on windows late at night, shapes that you could see moving near the trees, and fast movement outside of people's homes. It was then that one of the woman's neighbors finally saw something. He'd stepped onto his porch for a cigarette when he noticed a black figure standing outside her window. Bear in mind, this was not a shadow cast by something else. This shape looked solid, and somehow darker than the darkness around it. It was humanoid in appearance, but thin and too tall, with some glowing yellow eyes. The thing knocked on the woman's window a few times, then suddenly darted around the house so fast it blurred. He said it moved from window to window impossibly quickly, like it wasn't touching the ground, and then it ran across the road into the trees. The man kept staring at the spot where it disappeared. A few seconds later, it leaned out from behind one of the trees and looked directly at him with these huge yellow reflective eyes and a huge grin full of sharp teeth. My cousin said the guy was shaking so badly while telling the story, he could barely light another cigarette. By then, there were already more sightings spreading across the reserve. People claimed they saw it standing beside roads at night and watching from forests. Others claimed they saw it smiling at them from ditches whenever they passed in their cars. Everyone always described the same eyes and the same teeth. There was one woman who swore she saw it while standing at the edge of her trees while bringing out her garbage. The couple almost hit it with their car when it appeared in the middle of the road and never moved. And that was the exact night I went to the party. My friend arrived not long after my dad finished telling me this. He actually asked if I still wanted to go. But at 16, surrounded by other teenagers, I wasn't about to back out because of a ghost story. So this cottage sat deep in the woods outside the main roads. By the time we got there, the place was already crowded with drunk teenagers, and within 20 minutes everyone was talking about the thing. People kept telling stories, usually other people's, and getting louder and more nervous as more alcohol kicked into their system. Some genuinely believed it was an evil spirit, while others mocked it and thought it was funny. There were two specific drunk guys who mocked it openly. "If it's real, let it come here. Yeah, come at me." That kind of stupid, drunk bravado. The atmosphere changed after that. It's like everyone in the room suddenly became quiet. Oh, too familiar with the stupidity these two guys had just come out with, and the possible consequences for doing so. I left the sunroom to calm down a friend who was crying in the living room after that. While I was sitting there talking to her, I noticed the rocking chair outside on the porch, moving back and forth. There was no one in it, and there was no wind to speak of. I tried not to look directly at it. Growing up, we were taught not to acknowledge things like that, to not feed it attention or react. So I kept talking to my friend while watching the chair move from my peripheral vision. Then one of the girls in the sunroom screamed. Everyone jumped, and one of the guys near the window exploded out of his chair and sprinted through the French doors onto the porch, so violently the doors slammed against the wall. People were panicking now. The girl who screamed was crying hysterically, saying there was something sitting in the rocking chair staring at her through the glass. She described the same thing everyone else had been describing all week, a black figure with yellow eyes and a huge smile. The guy who ran outside disappeared towards the tree line while everyone else crowded together into the cottage. A few minutes later he came back looking pale and told us to start cleaning up immediately because we were leaving. Of course nobody argued with this, and we all started stuffing garbage into bags, and that was when we heard 3 knocks on the window. Not the same window, mind you. 3 different windows on different sides of the cottage. That's when people began freaking out. One guy stormed out of the bathroom yelling that someone had been tapping directly on the bathroom window while he was using it, and another girl came running from the bedroom, saying the same thing happened there. The scariest part was that every single person was accounted for and inside. There was no one outside, and the guy who chased after the thing earlier kept saying the same thing. Ignore it. Ignore it. We finally cleaned everything up and rushed outside towards the trucks. People were practically climbing over each other in an attempt to leave. I was standing beside the same guy near his truck when his expression changed noticeably. He looked past me into the darkness and shoved me hard into the passenger seat. Then he jumped in and tore out the driveway. A few days later, he told me what happened. When the drunk guy started mocking the spirit, he looked towards the porch and saw it sitting in the rocking chair behind the girl who screamed. He said it was staring directly at him the entire time. The moment he rushed out, it stood up and ran into the woods so fast it barely looked human. He followed it to the edge of the trees where it stopped and stared at him again from the darkness. Then later, while everyone was climbing into the trucks, he saw it standing only a few feet away from us beside the vehicle, which is why he shoved me in so violently. Apparently later that night they realized they'd forgotten to lock the cottage. He went back with another friend to secure it before dawn. The other friend, of course, refused to exit the truck, so he walked up alone, opened the cottage door, and apparently saw the thing standing inside waiting for him. He slammed the door and ran. Over the next few weeks, the sighting spread north into neighboring towns and other reservations, then eventually stopped altogether. And I think I'm glad of it. This happened to my father-in-law probably 10 years ago at a hunting camp in Alabama. It popped into my head as we were heading there tomorrow for a few days of deer hunting. He told me to go ahead and share his story. So, as some people probably know, we get out an hour or so before light and climb into a tree stand, ladder leading up to a seat in a tree, usually fairly deep in the woods to hunt. This foggy morning, my father-in-law had been in his stand for a few hours, and it was getting light, and he was reading a book as he waited for something to happen. Out of the fog, he hears a woman's voice, much closer than anyone should have been to him at the time. She is calling, "Hunter, oh Hunter," very sing-songy, like a mother calling for her child for dinner as he was playing outside. Now, as I said, he was pretty deep in the woods, and there are sticks and dried leaves everywhere. You generally make a pretty good racket going to your stand, which is why we go out so early. Not only that, but in order to know where he was and spot him camouflaged in a tree, she must have seen his light out when he walked out, followed him into the woods, and waited hours before calling to him. His first thought was the woman was calling for someone called Hunter, maybe her son. She called again, and he realized that he was the hunter. So he turns around, peers around the trees, and sees a young woman. She, in very few words and halting speech, explains that something is wrong with her hot water heater and asks if he can come and take a look. Now, the strangeness of the situation hadn't set in yet, and he is a give the shirt off his back kind of guy, not to mention he's 6'2" and nearly 300 pounds and with a gun, so he isn't really worried about this small woman and starts climbing down the tree to have a look. He follows her back to her mobile home, which borders our hunting land, probably a 10-minute walk, and she walks inside and leaves the door open. He's trailing behind a little, so he gets to the door, kind of knocks and sticks his head in and says hello, but there's no answer. Where he entered is a laundry room, and he can see in the room is a hot water heater, and water is just pouring out the valve at the bottom. Just absolutely pouring onto the floor. He walks over, turns the valve off, sticks his head in the house and says hello again, but there's nothing. Empty of people anyway, but it's a disaster inside. At that point, he starts to see how strange it all is and decides that this is just the sort of situation that gets you robbed and murdered, and nopes the hell out of there and hurries back to our cabin. Now, we have hunted this land for years since and have never seen anyone at this place, although, until this season, it has shown obvious signs of being lived in. So every time I pass by her place, which backs right up to the road we have to take to our hunting stands, I wonder if the lady in the trailer had nefarious intentions for my father-in-law. All of these stories either happened directly to me or my dad and his side of the family. They all took place on my grandparents' property in East Texas, about 15 minutes down a dirt road in the middle of nowhere. The land is huge, around 600 acres, and my family has used it for cattle ranching for 4 generations. If you spend enough time walking through the woods out there, you'll run into the remains of older structures scattered all over the property. There's an old brick well hidden deep among the trees, part of a chimney standing by itself in the woods, and what used to be an old general store, now collapsing into the ground. The only reason it's still standing is because nearby trees are holding it upright. Near the center of the property, my family built a simple hunting cabin overlooking a large pond that was added years later. The cabin itself isn't fancy by any means. It's a basic place to stay while hunting or fishing, with a long wooden porch stretching across the back. The first story happened years before I was even born, and came from my dad, my grandparents, and my 3 aunts. So one night they were driving home from Wednesday evening Bible study in town. At the time, local newspapers had been running small stories about people claiming to see unidentified lights around the area. Most people treated it like nonsense. While they were driving, my dad pointed out a light high above in the sky and sarcastically said something like, "It's a UFO." At first, it just looked like a distant light, but as they kept watching it, they realized it was getting closer. Then it descended directly into the road in front of them. My grandpa slammed on the brakes. According to all of them, the object completely blocked the dirt road. It was dark outside, so they couldn't make up much detail beyond lights arranged around a circular shape. My dad always said the only sound it made was a low humming noise. Meanwhile, My aunts were panicking and begging my grandpa to turn the truck around and leave. He refused and just sat there staring at it. After several seconds, the thing lifted off the road and hovered above the tree line beside them. My grandpa finally floored it and drove towards home as fast as he could, while the object kept pace with the truck through the trees on the right-hand side. Eventually it disappeared. A few minutes later they reached their property, and according to my dad, they saw the same object sitting in the back pasture roughly 200 yards away from the house. My grandpa ran inside, grabbed a shotgun, and by the time he came back out, the thing had lifted off again and disappeared for good. The second story happened about a year later, when my dad and my uncle Rick were raccoon hunting at night in the same area where the pond was eventually built. They were walking through the woods when they started hearing something moving beside them in the leaves. Whatever it was sounded large enough to clearly hear its weight crushing through the brush. Every time they swung their flashlights toward the sound, it would immediately come from the opposite side instead. This apparently went on for several minutes. Eventually they stood back to back with their flashlights aimed in the opposite direction, trying to catch whatever it was circling them, but they never saw anything. They only kept hearing movement running around them through the woods. My dad said it genuinely sounded like something pacing them the entire time. The experience that bothered me the most happened when I was around 17. My dad and I were spending the weekend at the cabin fishing and hunting. Inside the bedroom, there were 2 beds positioned side by side with a window between them overlooking the back porch. Sometime around 3 or 3:30 in the morning, I woke up suddenly to the sound of something running across the porch. At first I thought maybe I was still half asleep, but then it happened again. The porch was long, probably around 20 yards, and whatever was out there was moving from one end to the other at full speed. The footsteps were loud enough to shake parts of the porch boards beneath the window. Lying there and listening to it, I realized a few things almost immediately. First, whatever it was didn't sound like it was wearing shoes, and second, it only sounded bipedal, and third, it was heavy enough that every footstep landed with a hard thud. For the next 10 minutes or so, it kept alternating between sprinting across the porch and slowly pacing a few steps before suddenly taking off running again. I was completely awake by that point, staring at the ceiling, too scared to even turn my head towards the window. My imagination was making everything worse. I kept thinking if I looked out there, something would be standing inches from the glass staring back at me. Eventually, the noise woke up my dad. He had been snoring loudly until then, and the second his snoring stopped, the running outside stopped too. After that, the porch stayed completely silent for the rest of the night. About 6 months later, my dad was staying in the cabin alone. He was outside on the porch late at night, sighting in the laser on a new rifle, when something threw a rock at him from the darkness. He said it passed close enough to hear it whip by before hitting the porch railing. He immediately grabbed a flashlight and searched the field in front of the cabin, but there was nothing there. The area where the rock came from was completely open grass, with nowhere obvious for somebody to hide. He went back inside not long after that. The last strange thing happened the most recent time I stayed there. A few friends and I were sitting in the living room late at night talking when we heard 3 loud knocks hit the outside wall of the cabin. A few seconds later, 3 more knocks hit the other side of the cabin. Then a third set came further down near the kitchen area. There were no neighbors nearby, no roads close enough for random people to wander by, and no reason for anyone to be outside the cabin in the middle of the night miles away from town. None of us went out to check. A few years ago, my partner Tom and I spent 2 nights in a house in Cornwall, which is in the UK. The reason we picked this spot is that my mum and her family had stayed there back in the 1960s. And growing up, I had heard a lot of stories about it. My grandmother Margaret claimed she had seen and heard things there that she couldn't explain, and it was always referred to in the family as the haunted house. At some point, I found out the place still existed and was being rented out as a holiday cottage. There was no mention anywhere about any kind of history or reputation. Since we were already familiar with the stories, and both generally skeptical about that kind of thing, we decided to book it and see what it was like for ourselves. The house itself was fairly remote, set away from other properties, which made it quiet but also meant there wasn't really anyone else around. We stayed there for 2 nights. During that time, there were a few moments that felt unusual, small things that didn't quite make sense at the time, but nothing we could clearly point to anything specific. We talked about it a bit while we were there, but mostly just treated it as if it was one of those situations where something feels off without clear reason. After we left, we didn't think much more about it. A few months later, we were going through the photos from that trip. While looking through them, I noticed something that didn't line up. There were 2 photos of the house exterior that I had taken within the same minute, according to the timestamp on my phone. The angle between them was slightly different, but they were taken one after another. In the first photo, everything looked normal, but in the second, there appeared to be a figure in one of the windows that wasn't in the first image. We went back over the details to make sure we weren't missing something obvious. At the time those photos were taken, we had already spent the night at the house, locked it up and left for the day. We had rented the entire cottage and there wasn't anyone else staying there. The location itself was isolated enough that there weren't people nearby who could have been inside without us knowing. We tried to come up with a reasonable explanation, like a reflection or something outside lining up in a strange way, but nothing we came up with fully matched what was in the photo. The house does actually have a name, Lana Vale, which I originally didn't mention because I didn't want to affect the original owner's listing. Neither of us believes in ghosts, and we're still not claiming that it was us, but between what we experienced while we were there and what showed up in those photos afterwards, we haven't really been able to explain it away. This all happened around 2009 to 2010, at a small cabin on a family member's property. The place already had a nasty reputation of just feeling off, even before anything specific happened. As a kid, I stayed there a few times and never slept well. It was an isolated place, surrounded by woods, and there was always a sense of unease there that I could never really explain. Well, things escalated after a friend of mine called Chris stayed there for a while. He had been kicked out of his parents' house and was using the cabin temporarily. I did not know the full extent of his situation back then, but I later found out he had been using amphetamines and had developed an obsession with occult material. At some point while staying there, he carried out some kind of ritual in the basement involving a Ouija board and his own blood. He later had a serious breakdown, threatened family members and was forced to leave, and I only learned those details after the fact. Over time, I also found out that the land itself had some history. There had been arrowheads found in the surrounding fields, and people believed the area might have been used by Native Americans long before the property was built. I also discovered that my grandmother Helen had kept journals describing various ritualistic practices that she had done on the property over the years. None of that was something I knew when the following events happened. The first major incident happened during what was supposed to be a normal night. A few of us, myself, Mark and Jason, were in the cabin drinking and playing video games. At some point I noticed an old framed picture on the wall and decided to redraw it in my own style on a piece of paper. When I finished, I put it back where it had been and didn't think too much of it. Later that night, after we had all gone to sleep, we were woken up by a loud crashing coming from the kitchen. When we went back to check, the picture I had been messing with was no longer on the wall. It had ended up on the opposite side of the kitchen, with the frame and glass shattered. Based on where everything landed, it hadn't simply fallen, but travelled across the room with enough force to shatter into pieces onto the counter several feet away. While we were trying to process that, we noticed the bedroom door down the hall slowly opening on its own. That room had another friend and his girlfriend sleeping inside. The three of us who were awake just stood there watching until it was fully open, and none of us went back to sleep after that. The second incident happened on another night when we were watching a movie in the cabin. It was a comedy, and we had music equipment hooked up to the TV for sound. When out of nowhere, a distorted voice came through the speakers. It wasn't part of the movie, but it didn't sound like anything we recognized. It said something unclear, but we all heard it at the same time. At that exact moment, the trash bag we had next to the door tipped over on its own. Right after that, we heard a loud scraping noise from upstairs. When we went up to check, we found that a large, heavy wooden dresser had moved from its original position and was now blocking the door to one of the bedrooms. It would have taken significant effort to move it manually, and none of us had been upstairs since earlier that evening. The last experience was the one that made me stop going there entirely. I had gone back alone one night during winter to pick up some things I had left behind. It was snowing, and the entire area felt unusually quiet. Chris was with me but refused to walk down to the cabin, making excuses about needing to stay behind. As I approached the cabin, I felt a strong sense of dread that I hadn't felt before. When I went inside, my phone started making repeated sounds, as if it were trying to record audio but due to memory being full, couldn't. I hadn't touched it, and I didn't know why it was doing that. Inside, everything was off. My bag was still there as I had left it on the couch, and as I walked towards it, the heater in the hallway suddenly turned on with a loud, harsh sound. I froze in place. At the same time, I had the distinct sensation of being pulled towards the hallway, like there was some kind of force drawing me in that direction. What happened next is hard to explain. My body reacted without me consciously deciding to do anything. I raised my hands in front of me, and it felt like I was pushing against something. I also shouted something out loud, but it wasn't in a language I recognized or one I consciously chose to speak. It came out automatically. After a few seconds, the sensation stopped. I grabbed my bag and moved towards the exit, and as I reached the door, I shouted again, this time something shorter, and threw a nearby cord towards the wall. And immediately after that, the curtain on the nearest window snapped shut with force. I left as quickly as I could and ran back up the driveway, and we didn't stay after that. When I told Chris what had happened, his reaction stood out because he didn't seem surprised and said that there had been weird things before. At that point, I still didn't know about what he'd done in the cabin. I mean, there were probably explanations for individual parts of the events, but taken together, they were enough that I chose not to return. I was born and raised near California's Bay Area. One day, my father took me on a trip that started at the ferry port in Vallejo. I can't remember where exactly we departed, but I was probably 12 or so. I recall a large number of sea lions barking incessantly at the stop, but my father's goal was for us to visit a historic building just a short walk away. As far as I can remember, it was one of, if not the first courthouse in California. The outside of the building did have quite a bit of character, and at the time it served as a museum. Inside were all sorts of artifacts, such as gavels, legal texts, and books from the time. It was not a large building, and you could breeze through it quite quickly. Behind the courthouse was a cabin that was enclosed in a waist-high wooden fence. While the courthouse sat in a neatly manicured lot that drastically contrasted its weathered facade, the cabin was surrounded by thick overgrowth. The tour guide said something along the lines of it having housed the state's first senator. My father hung back and was chatting with the guide about 20 or so yards behind me while I leaned on the fence and stared at the front door alone. The door itself was wooden with a screen window. I was bored and just gazing in, when an older woman stepped into view. It immediately struck me as odd. Even at that age, I could only see her from the chest up, but her appearance was off. When retelling this story to others, I always likened her clothing as resembling Little House on the Prairie. I don't know if it was the lighting or lack thereof that could have played a part in it, but she also had a greyish hue to her as well. One thing that has always stuck with me was how she looked at me. The door was elevated as the cabin had a porch, but she lifted her chin and gazed down at me past her nose. It felt like an aggressive pose at that moment. This next part seems so corny, or a bad movie beat me to it, but this is exactly what happened. I turned my head and called out to the tour guide, "Are there supposed to be people in there?" She seemed a bit perplexed and said, "No one's been in there for 50 years. I turned back, as I planned to point out the hypocrisy in her statement, but the woman was gone. It all happened really fast, and I didn't mention it to anyone that day. Years later, I asked my father if he recalled the trip or specifically where the site of the museum was, but he didn't. I've done short little searches online to see if I could pinpoint the location, but I've never really done a deep dive, and I'm curious to find out if anyone has had a similar experience. This happened when I was in either 5th or 6th grade during a school camping trip somewhere in the mountains. Multiple classes from our school went, and we stayed in 2 different hotel-style lodges. One building was newer and looked fairly modern, while the other one, the one I was assigned to, was much older and mostly made of dark wood. Both buildings were isolated in the middle of a rural area surrounded by forest. The woods themselves were set back quite a distance, but at night, the whole place felt very remote. I was sharing a room with 2 classmates called Sam and Gina. That night, after everyone had settled down, Sam asked if I could keep playing on her Minecraft world for a while, because she was tired and wanted to sleep. I stayed up with her phone while both of them went to bed. I didn't mind, because I usually stayed up later than everyone else. The room itself was already uncomfortable. The television had been left on because none of us could figure out how to change channels, and it was just displaying static, with a constant low white noise. The bathroom door was also left ajar, because Sam apparently hated having to shut it at night. The bathroom was small and completely dark beyond the doorway. At some point while I'm sitting there playing quietly, I heard a noise coming from the closet. It sounded like someone moving hangers back and forth against the metal rack. At first I thought maybe someone had hung up a jacket earlier and it had slipped or fallen, but then I remembered we had all kept our clothes in the luggage bags. The closet should have been empty. The noise persisted for several seconds. The best way I can describe it is that it sounded like someone was either rummaging through hangers or trying to squeeze themselves into the closet. It wasn't loud enough to wake somebody, but in a quiet room it was impossible not to notice. I immediately felt uneasy and started quietly whispering to my friends to wake them up. Right after that, Sam suddenly sat upright in bed. I remember feeling relieved for a second, because I thought she had heard it too. But when I said her name, she just stared blankly towards me and said, "Hi, I'm Sam," and then immediately laid down again. The way she said it completely unsettled me. It sounded emotionless and strange, almost rehearsed. The next morning, she claimed she had absolutely no memory of doing that. I still don't know whether she was sleep-talking or messing with me or genuinely asleep. I had slept over at her house before and never saw her sleepwalk or talk. After that happened, I shut off her phone and tried forcing myself to go to sleep, because I was getting genuinely scared. I was lying facing Gina's bed while she had her back turned towards me. A little while later, I started hearing tapping sounds coming from the balcony window. At first, I assumed it was tree branches hitting the glass because that seemed like the obvious explanation. But when I looked outside the next morning, I realized the tree line was much further away than the building than I remembered. Nothing should have been close enough to touch the window. The tapping kept happening on and off. Then came the part that bothers me the most. I began hearing footsteps. The floor in the room creaked heavily when someone moved around, and these sounded exactly like slow footsteps crossing the wooden floor. I could hear weight behind them, if that makes sense. They seemed to start near the bathroom and gradually move closer towards my side of the room. I kept my eyes shut and pretended to be asleep. At the time, I tried convincing myself the sounds were coming from the room below us or somewhere down the hallway, but they genuinely sounded close enough to be inside our room. The creaking seemed too specific. Eventually, I worked up enough courage to slowly roll over like I was turning in my sleep so I could look, and nothing was there. The room looked exactly the same as before. Gina and Sam were both still in their bed, the television was still hissing static, and the bathroom doorway was still open and dark. Somehow, I eventually fell asleep after that. The next morning I asked both of them if they had heard anything during the night. Sam said no and didn't remember sitting up or talking to me at all. Gina, though, immediately mentioned the closet noise before I even described it. What really bothered me was that she heard the hangers rattling late in the night while both Sam and I were already asleep. The students staying in the room next to ours also mentioned hearing knocking noises and sounds like hangers moving. Nothing else really happened for the rest of the trip, and I still don't know what caused any of it. A few months ago, I took a trip to the Smoky Mountains with 2 friends. Before the trip, I had spent a lot of time reading about the national park because I liked the historic side of the place. I was especially interested in Cadi's Cove because of all the preserved cabins and old homesteads. While researching, I kept running into stories about hauntings connected to the area, but I honestly didn't pay much attention to them. I'm not really a superstitious person, and figured most of those stories were either exaggerated or just part of the tourist appeal. The day this happened, we had spent most of the afternoon driving into Cadi's Coop Loop and stopping at different buildings along the way. It was a slightly overcast day, and the area was busy with lots of other visitors. Eventually, we stopped at the Dan Lawson cabin. If you've never been there, it's an old 2-story cabin you can actually walk through. The inside is empty except for the structure itself, and there's a narrow staircase leading to the 2nd floor. But there is a wooden barrier at the top so visitors can't fully enter the upstairs area. You can only climb high enough to look into part of it. A small group had gone through the cabin shortly before we did. We passed them near the barn area as they were leaving, and we could clearly see them walking back towards their vehicle afterwards. By the time we circled back around to the cabin, they were already gone. At that point, it was just 3 of us walking slowly along the dirt path beside the cabin, talking about where we wanted to stop next. As we reached the left side of the building, all 3 of us heard footsteps upstairs. The sound started near the far side of the upstairs room, close to the single window opposite us, then moved quickly across the floor towards the blocked-off area above where we were standing. The footsteps were loud enough that we all stopped mid-conversation at the same time. The only way I can describe it is that whoever it sounded like was moving aggressively, almost angrily. The stomping was deliberate and genuinely sounded like a person walking forcefully from one side of the upstairs room to the other. At first, we assumed another group had gone back inside without us noticing, and Ryan immediately said something like, "There's somebody up there," and we walked back towards the entrance to check. Under normal circumstances, I probably wouldn't have gone back inside after hearing something like that, but it was daytime, and there were still other visitors in the general area, so we were convinced it had to be another person. We went through the entire cabin again, and there was no one there. The downstairs was empty, and when we looked up towards the 2nd floor from the staircase, there was no movement at all. The upstairs area is small enough, that you would have seen someone immediately if they were there. Melissa decided to walk part way up the staircase to look more closely, and almost immediately she backed down. She later said she suddenly felt pressure in her chest while standing there, like it was hard to breathe for a second. At the time, I thought maybe she'd just scared herself after hearing the footsteps, but she looked genuinely shaken. What bothered me the most was how specific and human the sounds were. We ended up leaving the area pretty quickly after that. Nothing else happened for the rest of the day, but the three of us kept bringing it up afterwards because none of us could come up with a reasonable explanation of where those footsteps came from. This happened when I was around 11 years old, and is the single worst paranormal experience I have ever had. My grandma was renting a log cabin in a very rural and isolated part of central North Carolina. The house was surrounded by trees and fields in every direction. Our closest neighbor was 2 miles away, and the nearest gas station or grocery store was a 20-minute drive. I think the isolated nature already added to the creepiness of the house as a whole. My grandma had only been living there for about 2 months, when she got into a serious motorcycle accident. My mum, my younger sister and I moved in with her to help take care of her as she recovered. We ended up staying there for nearly a year. Not long after we moved in, something strange started happening in the kitchen. Every night at exactly 9 p.m, the lights in the kitchen would start flickering, not dimming or buzzing, but would rapidly turn off and on again. At first, my grandma thought one of us kids was messing with the switches, but it kept happening even when no one was in the kitchen. Sometimes we would all be sitting in the living room, and we would see the lights flashing from down the hallway, or on a school night when everyone was in bed, we could see the lights going on and off from under the closed bedroom doors. Eventually, we just assumed it was something wrong with the wiring. My grandma mentioned it to the landlord, and he sent an electrician to look at it. The electrician checked everything and said the wiring was completely fine, but the lights kept flickering every night at exactly 9 p.m. After a while, we stopped reacting to it. It just became this weird nightly thing the house did. Then, one night during the summer, my grandma, my mum and I were all in the kitchen eating dinner and talking and laughing. Around 9 p.m. the lights started again. However, instead of the fast flickering we were used to, the lights started turning off and on slowly, almost like someone was standing there flipping the switch up and down on purpose. The room got quiet because we all noticed it. My grandma was standing in the kitchen buttering a piece of toast, and standing directly behind her was a tall shadow figure. It looked like the silhouette of a person wearing a tall hat. If you Google Hat Man, it looks exactly like the results, but there were no eyes. It was just hovering above my grandma. I could clearly see the figure when the lights were on, but when the lights went off, the figure was somehow darker than the darkness in the kitchen, and its outline was still present. I completely froze and just stared at it, my chest feeling so tight. The only way I can describe it is pure dread. The lights kept turning off and on while I stared at it. I know I wasn't imagining it, because it went on for about 15 seconds, then the light stopped and the figure was gone. I immediately started crying and went hysterical. My family kept asking what was wrong, and when I finally told them what I saw behind my grandma, they believed me. I never saw the figure again after that night, but the kitchen lights continued flickering at 9 p.m. every single night for the rest of the time we lived there, even after we moved out and my grandmother lived alone. To this day, when I'm around flickering lights, I get anxious. I was in high school, and my family rented a cabin in the mountains near Pigeon Forge and Gatlinburg for a week-long vacation. It sat deep in the woods on the side of a steep hill, surrounded by tall black trees and winding roads. During the day, it looked like every other smoky mountain rental cabin you see online, but once the sun went down, the place felt isolated and very creepy. Bear in mind there were no nearby lights visible through the trees, and at night, it almost felt like you were in your own little universe as there was nothing else around. There were 5 of us on the trip: me, my parents, my younger sister, and my grandfather, who had recently been diagnosed with dementia. The cabin had 2 floors. Upstairs was the kitchen, living room, and 2 bedrooms. A narrow staircase led down into a basement-style game room with a pool table and couch where I slept, and attached to the lower level was the master bedroom where my parents stayed. My sister slept upstairs on one couch, and my grandfather stayed in the second upstairs bedroom. The first night was completely normal, and the second night was when things started. I was lying on the downstairs couch sometime after midnight, unable to sleep, playing my Game Boy with the sound mute so that no one would wake up. The downstairs lights were off except for the glowing coming from the kitchen upstairs and the dim blue light from the television in my parents' room. The whole cabin creaked constantly from the settling wood and mountain wind, so every sound already kept me on edge a little. At some point, I started hearing quiet mumbling from across the room. At first, I assumed it was my parents, talking in their bedroom with the TV on. Their door was partially open, and sound echoed strangely through the downstairs area, so I ignored it. But after a few minutes I realized I couldn't actually make out words. It sounded like someone speaking just quietly enough to stay unintelligible, this low and steady murmuring, like hearing a conversation through a wall. That was when I turned off the Game Boy and started listening carefully. And of course the mumbling stopped immediately. The next night it happened again. At the same time, the same low voice coming from somewhere downstairs. This time I got up and walked directly into my parents' room, expecting to catch them talking. Both of them were sitting silently watching Family Guy, and neither of them had said a word. I asked them what they were talking about. My mum looked at me confused and said, "What are you talking about?" I told them I heard mumbling again, and my dad shrugged it off immediately and said I was probably hearing the TV upstairs bouncing off the walls. I tried to convince myself that that was true and went back to the couch. And maybe 5 minutes later, I heard a pool ball roll across the table beside me. It made that unmistakable heavy clacking sound that billiard balls make when they slowly drift across felt and tap another ball. And I sat there, staring into the darkness at the outline of the pool table. Thankfully after that nothing moved, but I couldn't sleep much that night. And by the 4th night, the noises were happening constantly. The mumbling would start, fade away, then start again somewhere else. The pool balls rolled intermittently across the table even when no one was touching it, and once or twice I heard the soft click of balls bumping into each other. Every time I worked up the courage to look directly at the table, everything was still. The cabin itself also felt different by then. It's hard to explain, but the downstairs area had started to feel oppressive. The game room smelled faintly damp and old, and every time I looked towards the dark staircase leading up to the kitchen, I had the overwhelming feeling that someone was just standing there outside my view. The last night there was the worst. I was lying awake again on the couch, almost expecting the noise by that point. The pool cue had been left lying flat across the center of the table earlier that evening after my dad and I played a few games. And sometime deep in the night, I heard the return of the mumbling, and a pool table rolling and another, and suddenly there was an explosive crack directly behind me. One of the pool sticks had slammed onto the hardwood floor so hard it made me jump upright. Bear in mind, I'm not saying slid off, because if you don't know about pool tables, it's got a raised circumference, so it couldn't have slid off anyway. It slammed onto the hardwood floor. I whipped my head towards the table and saw the cue stick lying several feet away while on the floor. And right after that, something moved. Across the opening leaning towards my parents' bedroom, I saw what looked like a shadow pass by. Not a person exactly, more like a dark shape crossing through darker darkness, semi-transparent for only a moment, but unmistakably there. And before I could even process it, I felt something gripped my ankle. It was ice cold, and every hair on my body immediately stood on end. I launched myself off the couch so fast I barely remember crossing the room and practically dove into my parents' bedroom in a full panic. The second I did, my mum sat upright and immediately said, "Did you see the shadow too?" That sentence honestly scared me more than whatever I'd just experienced. Before I could answer, my sister came running downstairs asking what happened because she heard yelling and movement. My dad turned the TV off completely, and we were all quiet for a few seconds, and that's when all of us heard the mumbling. Low voices somewhere downstairs near the pool table, and the sound of the pool balls rolling. My mum immediately thought my grandfather had wandered downstairs in his confusion because of the dementia, and my dad went upstairs to check on him while the rest of us sat there frozen, listening to the sounds below us. The entire time my dad was upstairs, we could still hear the mumbling. He eventually came back and said my grandfather was fully asleep in bed. None of us slept the rest of the night. I've always tried to stay skeptical about paranormal stuff. I'm usually the first person looking for a logical explanation, especially when old buildings are involved, because old houses make noises constantly. Doors shift, pipes rattle, and your brain will tend to fill in the gaps if you're tired. That said, my family's lake cottage is one of the few places that genuinely frightens me. Now, the cottage has been in our family for over 75 years, though the building itself is much older than that. Part of it originally came from a farmhouse built sometime in the 1800s and was later moved into a small lot near the lake. Over the years, different relatives added on to it in a piecemeal way, so the whole place feels uneven and structurally off anyway. One section is apparently still supported by an old car jack underneath. It's small overall, with 2 bedrooms and a bathroom between them, a cramped kitchen and a living room that opens towards an enclosed porch, added by my great-grandparents decades ago. From the outside you can clearly tell where the original farmhouse ends, and where the later additions begin. For as long as I can remember, everyone in my family treated one particular bedroom strangely. My mum hated sleeping there as a kid. Later, my siblings and I avoided it too. No one had a specific story that would explain why. The room itself just felt uncomfortable. Even during the day, there was something oppressive about it that was pretty hard to describe. It overlooked the enclosed porch through one of the original farmhouse windows, and at night, that window always bothered me for reasons I could not fully explain. During COVID, I ended up staying there alone for a few months because my dad worked as a nurse in a COVID ward, and we wanted to minimize risk to him. The cottage was empty, so it seemed practical. At first it was fine, and that's when little things started happening often enough that we could no longer ignore them. I would wake up and find cupboard doors open, specifically after remembering shutting them. Small items would fall during the night in other rooms where nothing had been near them. Sometimes I'd hear movement in the kitchen after I'd already gone to bed. Being there alone seemed to amplify everything, but the worst part quickly became that bedroom that everyone disliked, because every night, the door would open on its own. At first I assumed the latch just didn't catch properly because of the cottage floors. As I said, they're uneven, and the whole structure seemed to shift constantly. I started making sure it latched firmly before bed, then locked it. When that didn't work, I physically shoved furniture in front of it before going to sleep. I would still wake up and find the door standing open again. After a while, I stopped even trying to sleep in there. I moved out of the living room and left lights on, almost constantly, because the cottage felt incredibly dark at night, especially once the lake area quieted down after midnight. I kept the overhead light on along with 2 lamps and the porch light outside. One night I woke up suddenly and immediately noticed something wrong with the room. Everything was illuminated except for the upper corner of the television. That section looked unnaturally dark, almost like a patch of black fog hanging there, not a shadow cast by anything I could identify. I sat there staring at it for probably 30 seconds in an attempt to make sense of what I was seeing. The rest of the room was completely visible, and that was the last night I stayed there alone. The next morning I packed my things and left before sunrise. Even the drive home felt uncomfortable. It was foggy and still dark outside, and several times I thought I saw shapes moving near the road ahead of me. Looking back, it was probably just exhaustion and stress and spending weeks alone in that place, but it honestly seriously rattled me. Later on, while talking with a co-worker about strange experiences, I showed her a few photos I had taken of the cottage during my stay there. She immediately pointed out one of the dark porch windows and said something about it bothered her. When we zoomed in, there did seem to be a shape standing near the curtain inside. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I really hope you've enjoyed tonight's stories. It's probably been the hardest episode to make in a really long time, because it's just painful to talk right now. Anyway, I will be probably in the comments at some point tomorrow, and I'll update you guys on what the doctor says I need to do, because I've never had this before and it's really weird and sort of concerning. Anyway, I would like to give one final thank you to my members and patrons, whose names can be seen on screen. Oh, and that's another thing I forgot to mention at the start. I'm not going to upload any exclusive content for anyone until my voice is recovered, just because I don't want to put extra strain on, so I apologize for that too. Sorry guys, I'll try and double up next week when my voice is better, hopefully. Anyway, thank you all so much for your support, and I'll see you in the next one. Good night.